Long before the Gaza war erupted in 2023, a growing consensus had taken hold across policymaking, activist, and foreign policy circles. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was stuck in a political and diplomatic dead end. The Oslo framework and the notion of a two-state solution had largely lost its credibility as a path to resolution. Developments on the ground since Hamas's October 7 attacks have only made a two-state outcome harder to envision. Yet, the two-state solution remains the default language of Middle East diplomacy. Most recently, UN Secretary-General António Guterres said he was determined to oppose Israeli actions that undermine it, calling for renewed momentum toward Palestinian statehood. So, is the two-state solution still viable? And if not, what alternatives exist? In today's episode, we unpack the debate over how to move forward on the Israeli-Palestinian question in a way that delivers a democratic, rights-respecting outcome. Welcome to Rethinking Democracy with Gönül Tol. Today, I'm joined by two great experts, Michael Schaefer-Ömerman and Sarah Leah Whitson. Michael is the director for Israel-Palestine at Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now. And Sarah is the organization's executive director. Michael, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Well, before we dive in, let me start first by congratulating you on your new book, From Appetite to Democracy, A Blueprint for Peace in Israel-Palestine, which came out recently, right, in the fall, in September. And I know you both argue that the two-state solution is no longer viable and that you're proposing an alternative framework. And I will ask you to unpack that in a moment. But before we go there, I want to start with this. For Middle Eastern governments, Europeans and successive American administrations that still insist the two-state solution is the only option. And some in good faith, how do they think we actually get there? Do they have a reasonable, realistic pathway, Sarah?
There really is no pathway. At this point, the notion of a two-state solution pursuant to the Oslo process is really just rhetorical. There is no roadmap that will actually lead the international community to ending apartheid and creating new model of statehood, whether under Oslo or anything else. And that is exactly the void we're trying to fill. I think that the reason why the international community is so loyal to the rhetoric of the Oslo process and the two-state solution, even though it's over 30 years old, is because there's nothing else, is because this was the last plan that, at least on paper, Israelis and Palestinians and most of the international community accepted. And so there's a desperate desire to resurrect the carcass of the Oslo process two-state solution. But I think, as we all know, that's just not possible. And so our plan, doesn't dispense with the idea that there might ultimately be two states in the land of Israel-Palestine. That remains an option. But we do put in a plan that will most definitely end apartheid and occupation, regardless of what the actual subsequent decisions about governance, whether one state or two states and so forth, are.
Michael, was there ever a moment when the stars really aligned? Inside Israel and Palestine and the US and the region, when a two-state solution was genuinely possible. After Oslo, the two-state solution became the cornerstone of the peace process. But many people argue that it was deeply flawed from the start, right? So, reducing these profound historical, religious, existential claims to technical debates over borders and recognition was never going to satisfy either side. So was there, in fact, a real missed opportunity?
I think there probably were lots of missed opportunities, but that's a little bit of a separate question from whether it was ever possible. As you said, there's lots of analysis on why the Oslo process and the vision for a two-state solution that it put forward was flawed and perhaps fatally flawed from the outset. But the Oslo process demonstrated something that I think we need to remember, which is that it gave people hope, and it gave both Israelis and Palestinians a desire to seek a different path, and people got on board with it, even if for a short amount of time before it was derailed by various spoilers in Israel and in Palestine. But there's a few separate things here. The first is that yes, it was flawed. And it was flawed largely due to the skewed power dynamics, which put Israeli interests always above Palestinian ones, and which had the United States as the sort of leader of the international community that was stewarding this process, always taking Israel's side. As one of the former American negotiators from Camp David put it, America acted as Israel's lawyer, not as a mediator. The second thing is that, it deprioritized ending the situation of occupation and what we've come to understand and accept as apartheid to seeking a sort of perfect or acceptable broader political vision. And what we're trying to accomplish here is to argue and effectively prove that you can reverse that order, that you don't need to know what the perfect political solution is. You may not even need to have one in order to end the unacceptable situation, this criminal situation of permanent occupation and apartheid. So, it was flawed. There were certainly missed opportunities. Did it ever have a chance? Would Palestinians ever have gotten on board without, to a final status solution without refugees and return and really any lack of real sovereignty? Probably not. But there was a genuine, earnest willingness to pursue this path, and the fact that it failed, I think, is less important than the unwillingness necessarily mentioned of the international community of Palestinians and of Israelis to go back to the table and start thinking creatively about what can be done today.
You raised several important points. You said how, the whole process, the international community, they deprioritize ending the occupation in favor of this broader vision, which almost became like a slogan, right? The two-state solution, but it wasn't. It was never viable. So, do you think U.S. pursuit of a two-state solution, did that play a role in the deadlock that we find ourselves in right now? Sarah, what do you think?
Hey, well, absolutely. And I think Mike alluded to this, and there have been numerous writers that have written on this. The United States was not an even-handed broker. The United States was not a true mediator. The United States was and continues to be a partisan. It is an active party to Israel's war in Gaza, ongoing war in Gaza, regardless of the simultaneous process of this board of peace and so-called Gaza ceasefire plan. And during the Oslo process as well, the United States continued to arm and protect Israel, arm it to provide it with the weapons to maintain its occupation and apartheid rule, political support to protect it from any efforts of international accountability at the UN Security Council and other international bodies. So the notion that the United States would somehow nevertheless be a fair, independent, neutral mediator between Palestinian demands and Israeli demands, I think, was completely implausible to begin with. obviously, the Palestinian leadership, in an access of good faith and probably desperation, went along with the effort and accepted this as perhaps their only opportunity for a negotiated solution. And they negotiated and they reached an agreement. But predictably, the Israeli government, which is the author of the occupation, annexation, apartheid rule, did not even comply with the agreement that they promised the Americans they would comply with. It has been a deeply, deeply flawed process. And the Palestinians have the great misfortune of having not just Israel on the other side, but having the United States, the world's greatest superpower, on the other side.
And maybe this is a question for both of you. What do Palestinians want? I'm thinking of this poll. I think it was from September 2025 Gallup poll, showing that support for a two-state solution is falling on both sides among Israelis and Palestinians. It's clear why that's happening in part. I mean, you have ongoing settlement expansion, Israel's control over the West Bank and Gaza have convinced many people, Palestinians, that a viable the state is no longer possible. And obviously there is, I mean, when territory is fragmented and political space keeps shrinking, that outcome starts to feel like a fiction. But I'm curious, are there other factors driving this decline in support? Maybe generational shifts, internal Palestinian political dynamics, or leadership failure. So what else should we be paying attention to?
You know, I as you mentioned, it's quite understandable that support for any sort of peaceful vision for the future that involves sort of coexistence and living alongside each other would feel less desirable and further away after the past 2.5 years of genocide and war. What I think I would say, though, is that more importantly, if you look at the history of polling over the past few decades, it goes up and down, meaning what people want correlates to what is available to them at that moment. And if you give them different options, they may make different choices. Now, I'm not Palestinian. I can't speak to what Palestinians want. I am an Israeli citizen, but I can't speak for what all Israelis want either. What we can say is that when there has been a viable process and when there has been a viable, believable sort of hope or positive vision for what might be done differently, more people come on board with it. There's always, going to be people who are not okay with it, who are sort of more fundamental in their political aspirations or views. But I do believe that the majority of people, if given an option, of given a vision, a positive vision that actually seems viable of how things could be differently, that would end the situation of apartheid and occupation, that would grant the self-determination to all people, particularly themselves, that they would be willing to consider it and certainly, maybe even get on board and participate. That said, and not to contradict that at all, there are lots of different Palestinian movements looking for many different, advocating for many different outcomes, from one-state campaigns to, there's not so many left outside of the Muqatta and Ramallah who are advocating for a two-state solution, and others who are far more fundamental in advocating for basically the expulsion of Israelis from the land. But this is also another factor that we need to consider here, is that Israel has worked very diligently for the past 100 years to prevent and stymie the emergence of any effective Palestinian leadership, and to fragment the Palestinian polity such that it's very difficult to build national consensus and national movements in a way that might actually be constructive and which could, actually contend with the forces that Israel imposes on them.
Recently, I was speaking with a group of young Palestinian activists, and they said They see this moment as a very critical, hopeful moment. Many of them said, you see all these countries trying to do something about it. We are finally back on their agenda, and Israel is being isolated, and more countries are talking about recognizing Palestine. So they see this as a big opening. But I want to hear your take on that. This international push for recognition. I feel like that is not really that won't deliver anything meaningful. I mean, these countries, they almost replace this with a policy. They push this as a policy, but it's not a policy. What's your take on that, Sarah?
Well, I mean, two things. One is that I think the Palestinians that you spoke with are correct in a very, very important way, in that October 7 and its aftermath has been a global game changer. It has truly woken up the international community from its slumber, from its deliberate disregard of Palestine, from a very strong wish that they could ignore Palestine and Palestinians. And this is a wish that was echoed by Jake Sullivan and the Biden administration, in the Gulf leadership, that thought that they could supposedly normalize with Israel without penalty and without cost, because after all, who cares about Palestinians now? And what October 7 and its horrendous aftermath has, the very sort of painfully costly silver lining, is that the whole world has shifted its opinion on Palestine, has reawakened global attention to Palestine. And particularly in the United States, I don't think Israel's reputation will recover. But at the same time, you're right that the sort of easy leaning into recognizing the statehood of Palestine as somehow the punishment for Israel's genocide. And this is exactly the words used by, for example, the British government in saying why they're recognizing the state of Palestine. Well, it's because of the crimes Israel committed in genocide. That's a non sequitur. That is not, those are, the creation of statehood for Palestinians is not a punishment for Israel, and it's very unfortunate that it was presented as such, but it's the only thing they have to cling to, and that's exactly the problem that our book is trying to address by creating a pathway, by creating a process that could replace the dead Oslo two-state solution, that can replace the empty, hollow, performative gestures of recognizing Palestine as a state when it has obviously no sovereign power whatsoever.
Michael, in your book, you argue that, the two-state solution is not viable, and you propose an alternative that would secure democratic rights for both Israelis and Palestinians. So what is that alternative?
Right. So, our book sort of Sarah Lee and I identified what we believed was a void in the sort of international policy discourse about Israel-Palestine, one that had been created by the sort of dogmatic clinging to the two-state solution and the Oslo process as the only way forward. So, there are lots of people, and we've talked about this up until now, who describing the problems and even seeking out punitive consequences for Israel's permanent occupation and apartheid rule. And, we have International Court of Justice opinions and UN resolutions and every possible type of documentation and prescription of what's happening. We have groups like the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement who are trying to create real consequences in order to force a change. The same could be said for J Street and all those advocating for a two-state solution. They're trying to change the calculus such that something else is possible. And then we also have other groups that are out there with a vision of what things could look like, whether it's one-staters or two-staters, or groups advocating for a confederation or a federalist model or even regional integration. What we don't have, and as I said, What we don't have, because of this dogmatic clinging to the Oslo process and the two-state sort of ghost, is any idea of how to get from plan A to point B. Meaning, if the world were to accept, if the international community were to accept that Israel is an apartheid regime and treated it accordingly, the way that it did South Africa, putting increased international pressure and isolation, and what are the positive demands? Because it's a lot easier to advocate for that kind of pressure and isolation when you can articulate what it is that you want Israel to be doing. So we set out to really at a granular policy practical level map out, create a blueprint for how you would go about dismantling Israel's apartheid and occupation regimes. The two primary aspects, genocide sort of set aside for the moment, that there is large international consensus about the illegality of these regimes. And we do that not just because it's imperative to end crimes, and the ending crimes can't be conditioned on the emergence of the perfect political partners, but also because we believe that by creating a more equal or level playing field, that it'll be possible to answer the bigger questions of what the future looks like. And as Sarah said in the beginning, this plan, it transforms the current reality, a one-state reality, where Israel is the effective sovereign over the entire territory in different ways, over different people in different places. And it transforms that into a singular regime, which resembles one democratic state. But that's a transitory outcome. We don't create that because we think it's the best possible outcome or the best possible solution or the most desired one, but because it's better than what there is today, and it would make possible democratic decision making to decide the future by the people who would be most affected by the people who live under that regime or those regimes.
So the first step, what you're proposing, is to dismantle the apartheid regime. And how do you propose to do that?
It's two things. It's dismantle the apartheid regime and dismantle the occupation, and they're entangled. It's hard to disentangle them, but they are separate and discrete. The occupation specifically is based on a series of military orders that give the Israeli military the powers to rule over the Palestinian civilian population and territory, and to subject them to different legal systems and give them different rights, and which effectively leaves them under the governance of Israel without any democratic recourse or ability to affect that leadership in any way. That's relatively simple to end on paper. You just revoke those military orders and grant rights to everybody who was previously living under them. Apartheid is much more complex. It exists in nearly every institution and every sort of set of laws and policies that have developed in Israel over the past 80 some odd years. And that requires a much more sort of deep dive into what is discriminatory by intention, what is discriminatory by circumstance, and how you address those in a way that not only gives all of the inalienable rights and equal rights to Palestinians, but also doesn't create new wrongs and another forced mass displacement in the process. And so to do that, I can give a few examples. But we overhaul the judicial system, because the Israeli High Court of Justice and the Israeli Supreme Court have been a fundamental pillar of the occupation and apartheid regime, not for restraining it, but for effectively giving it the legal framework in which to exist. And the Israelis like to point to that minor restraint as a sort of democratic feature, but really it's just more clearly defined what apartheid and occupation are. There's extension of full freedom of movement to everybody within the territory immediately. with some small sort of caveats, but really ending the use of the division of space and people as a tool for control, and as a way of depriving people of their livelihood, of their land, of their family life, of their political opportunities. The integration of security forces. You can't. It's really impossible to imagine a regime that is fair and good to all the people living under it if security forces are only made up of one group, which are half or less than half of the population. So along with an overhaul of discriminatory laws, it's this type of sort of very granular, like, this is what needs to happen and in this order, in order to dismantle this regime, which unfortunately has become part and parcel of the state of Israel and its sort of political project.
Yes, that's my next question, Sarah. I mean, to be able to dismantle that regime, you certainly need willing political partners on the Israeli side, right? So how will that come about?
Right. And you're putting your finger on the most challenging aspect of the blueprint and probably the least satisfying of the blueprint to our readership. We rely on consent. We rely on the consent of the Israeli people and the Palestinian people and everybody else who lives between the river and the sea to accepting the transitional process, to accepting a transitional government, a caretaker government, to accepting the dissolution of the state of Israel and the nominal state of Palestine, and transferring all of their powers to a caretaker government under UN auspices and sort of oversight, but with the participation and let's call it technocratic government of the caretaker government that is appointed by a consociational conference to establish this caretaker government. What we are hoping for is that the blueprint is an essential ingredient to what such a transition would require, and that is international pressure and domestic pressure on Israelis, principally because they are the power holders, to choose this alternative over the status quo of global isolation, global revulsion as citizens of a pariah state, a state enmeshed in endless wars, a state in which Israeli children are conscripted into the military and face never-ending call to duty, a state where it's not just the Palestinians who don't live in security. Obviously, they don't, but Israelis also do not live in security, do not live in peace. And we think that by offering an alternative to that, an off-ramp from the current situation, that can help persuade Israelis and Palestinians to choose the blueprint instead of the status quo of not just permanent occupation, but what I predict is full genocide and full mass expulsion of Palestinians. I want to believe in my heart, and this book is an exercise in faith and hope as much as it is a technical document, that people will choose for their children the most secure, the most peaceful, the most positive future if that option exists for them. And that's what we're trying to put forward.
I guess what I'm struggling with is this, with the vision that you're proposing is Israel's current self-definition. I mean, Israeli peoples, and how, if at all, it could transition into to a let's say single state based on full equality for Israelis and Palestinians, because a Jewish state as it exists today, it's at odds with what you're proposing, which requires laws and symbols, state policies that do not privilege Jews over Palestinians. But again, Israel today, especially post-October 7, Israel thus confirm clear advantages to Jews, I mean, whether in migration, housing, employment, political rights. So the question is, why would Israeli Jews willingly give up those advantages? That international isolation, is that a strong enough motivation? I mean, history suggests that states rarely undertake such profound changes to their national identity in response to external pressure. It requires internal transformation, and I'm not sure whether the mood in the country right now is going in that direction.
Well, a couple of things. First, if just to conclude related to the prior point, and then I'll give it to Mike. Sorry, Mike, I cut you off. We are relying not just on international pressure, not just the implementation of the General Assembly resolution calling for states to impose sanctions to end business and trade, to end diplomatic relations with Israel because of its ongoing occupation, illegal occupation. But domestic pressure as well. And the domestic pressure is reflected in the situation of war, the situation of insecurity, the situation of permanent conscription, which are not happy outcomes for Israelis. They certainly are holding the longer end of the stick. Certainly they are better off. And certainly people with power don't easily relinquish that. But sometimes they do. They do when there's a better alternative. The Afrikaner government in South Africa, certainly like Israeli government and its apartheid rule, delivered all the advantages and privileges to the whites to the detriment of the blacks. They voluntarily ceded that power under tremendous pressure, under military pressure, under domestic pressure, under international pressure. Those things happen, right? The fall of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, effectively was governments ceding power, governments agreeing to break up their empire and break into smaller states and different political configurations. So those moments are possible, but in order for them to be possible, there needs to be an alternative option. There needs to be thinking about what could replace the current apartheid status quo.
I would just add to that, I agree with both of you. We're not there today. Israelis are not ready to give up that privilege. If they were, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I believe that the sort of the factors that could possibly converge to create that kind of political will do exist and can exist. And it's not just international pressure. The Israeli society was struggling with very deep political and societal cleavages before October 7th and this war over what type of country it was going to be. There's an active power struggle between secular Israelis, who tend to be the more liberal ones, between sort of ultra-Orthodox Jewish Israelis who basically just want to be able to live their very sort of enclaved life with state support and not having to contribute militarily. And this sort of expansionist, almost messianic settler movement, which I think is much bigger than just the settlers, which really sees the survival of Jewish Israelis and Zionism as necessitating constant expansion, almost in the same way that capitalism requires growth. That they have to control everything. And, we hear this explicitly. Benjamin Netanyahu said it 15 years ago, and he said it again last week. Israel will always control the territory between the river and the sea militarily. That is the only way that his vision, this sort of settler messianic vision of Zionism in Israel, can exist. However, those forces are going to continue to clash, particularly, I think, once the temporary unity of being at war subsides. The economic pressures sewn into those cleavages will continue to be substantial and create pressures. And I've mentioned this a few times in other interviews, but I'd like to mention it again. I was listening to an interview with two mainstream Israeli economists on the Israeli public broadcaster a few months ago. And surprisingly, they were advocating for a federalist model for the entire territory minus Gaza, because Israelis can't wrap their head around Gaza, and they never have been able to, really. But the interesting part to me was why they thought this was necessary. And what they basically said is that with the Palestinian population of Israel, which we tend to exclude in these conversations about what Israelis want, but more than 20% of Israelis are actually Palestinian, voting with voting rights and tax paying and all that. But the economic factors alone in how these groups want to use the state coffers, who is contributing to them. The two biggest contributors to the state budget are military exports and high tech. Now, the military exports are subject to embargoes, although that seems like a lesser threat today than it did a year ago. But the high tech sector is particularly vulnerable. The revenue doesn't just come from individual employees who pay taxes. The Israeli high-tech economy and the way that it's supported the country is highly dependent on exits, on these large, multi-billion-dollar sales, 30% of which, roughly, goes to the Israeli government as a tax. And what we're seeing more and more is Israeli high-tech founders and leadership of existing companies deciding that it's more in the it's in the interests of their companies and their future business to start those companies overseas, to register them overseas, or to move as much of them as possible overseas, and even explicitly moving cash reserves out of the shekel and out of Israel, and that can create a kind of bank run. And as Sarah Lee was alluding to, these sort of large changes in the world oftentimes seem like they're coming out of nowhere, these black swan moments, but really, you can identify the factors that could lead there. And I think there are enough of those that it could increase the costs of the current situation for Jewish Israelis, such that they're willing to consider something else. And I hope those costs are not too great. I have close family in Israel, and I lived there for the better part of 20 years, and I hope for the prosperity of all people, not just Palestinians and not just Israelis. But as we've mentioned in the past couple's questions, nobody gives up privilege and power voluntarily. It has to be a calculation of cost and alternative, and creating a higher cost and providing a viable alternative, however they come about, I think is the key to reaching that moment of political will that makes a plan like ours perceivable or viable.
I want to talk about that alternative. Yes, let's assume that the costs have become too much, and we secured that commitment. So what comes next is it's a one state, a single country, encompassing pre-1967 Israel and West Bank, Gaza, and everyone living between the river and the sea. They would all enjoy equal rights regardless of ethnicity and religion, including the right to live anywhere in the land and to vote in national elections. So my question is, it's a technical thing, but does that state rely solely on individual rights, or could it also take a binational form where Jews and Palestinians retain certain collective or communal rights as well?
So the notion of the caretaker government or the transitional government is that it is a 3-year temporary government that has very narrow and limited mandate. Its mandate is to end Israeli crimes of occupation and apartheid, and Mike described the process that we envision for that. And second, it's to create a democratic groundwork, a democratic institutional framework so that at the conclusion of the transitional government, at the conclusion of a 3-year period, there can be a referendum where the people living between the river and the sea can democratically decide on what they want their future governance to look like. We do not, I think there are two ways in which the plan is, I think, a departure from past failed peacekeeping efforts, not just in Israel-Palestine, but in other places. Number one, as Mike mentioned, we prioritize ending Israeli crimes ahead of questions of governance. We don't condition ending the occupation on a peace plan, etc. But number two, we don't rely on collective representation of Palestinians or Israelis as a monolithic block where one Israeli can vote for all Israelis, because certainly all Israelis have the same view. Similarly for Palestinians. And we reject that very identitarian, ethnic-based division to, in fact, allow the people between the living river and the sea as human beings, as individuals, to choose what future governance they want to see, whether one state or two states. And if that referendum process fails, let's say, the default is indeed one democratic state. That is what the transitional government will leave with. But that is not necessarily what we are prescribing, because we do truly believe in democratic decision-making, and we truly want to see all of the people living between the river and the sea participating in that decision-making process about their future governance. And finally, we don't assume that all Palestinians will vote alike or all Israeli Jews will vote alike. They may. I think that is one of the things that people have challenged me on. But we also envision a possibility where, say, a liberal secular Israeli Jew and a liberal secular Palestinian may vote more similarly than their conservative religious cohorts in their own communities.
I think this is just a great thought exercise. And when I try to wrap my mind around all the details, just so many questions come up. One thorny issue, for example, is what will happen to the right of return, right, on both sides? Because, what happens, for instance, to Israel's law of return? It's a core pillar of the Jewish privilege built into the state. And I think there's also a parallel dilemma on the Palestinian side, right? Palestinians claim a right of return to homes and land that they were forced from before 1948. And most Israeli Jews would strongly oppose such an influx. And yet I can't think of Palestinians agreeing to any solution that doesn't explicitly recognize and address that right. So how do you envision that?
Yeah. So first off, this is Palestinians don't claim a right of return. It's deeply fundamental right within international law that people have the right to return after seeking refuge or escaping war. To answer your question, I'd say first that one of the first things that the transitional government does in this plan is recognize the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and recognizes their connection to whatever government will come after the transition. However, we believe that because the sort of the ultimate configuration, political configuration, or where borders are drawn, if borders are drawn, could change so fundamentally what the right of return looks like, that it's not appropriate in this plan, in the specific plan, to resolve the whole thing. Secondly, we do take certain steps to right that wrong immediately, starting with the restoration of freedom of movement within the territory. A great number of Palestinian refugees are internally displaced either within Israel or from what is Israel today into Gaza or the West Bank or East Jerusalem. And that alone, I think, sets an important precedent that return is not only possible, but that it, to help Israeli Jews wrap their mind around the idea that it might not be suicidal as well for them. So there's lots of sort of technical ways that we approach it in addressing basically every aspect of transitional justice that we can, which doesn't preclude a democratic decision to split into two states or stay as one, or a confederational model, or anything else. So we recognize the right of Palestinian refugees. We provide for immediate family reunification, and resettlement and return for anybody whose life is in danger at that moment, and it's going to be on the new democratic government to decide how to resolve that issue. And that's not a satisfactory answer, but the sort of the piece that I cling on to here, and that I try and emphasize to folks, is that the scenario in which we're describing makes it a lot more possible to resolve the refugee issue than the reality that we're living in today. And if we can move things to a place where it's possible to resolve it, where it seems viable and even imaginable to start resolving that, first off, just by removing separation as a key component of life and the regime, but also in enfranchising Palestinians, granted not immediately Palestinian refugees, and I understand that that's going to be a non-starter for a lot of people, but it creates a power dynamic in which it's far more possible to resolve the Palestinian refugee issue, which needs to be resolved, and how it's resolved is not on us to decide. International law is quite clear about the very different, the three or so different outcomes that are acceptable for refugees: resettlement, integration, or return. But yeah, that's not on us to decide. But we hope that the framework that we're putting forth can provide a ground that's safe enough and fertile enough and equal enough where those decisions can be made in a satisfactory way.
When I was reading your book, one of the first questions that came to my mind was whether Jews and Palestinians could actually function as co-citizens. I mean, could they, after so much trauma, could they build these working partnerships, or at least coexist in a way that allows a single state and society to operate without constant ethnic tension or violence? I mean, you wrote this book, and I'm so glad you did. So you clearly believe that it's possible. But maybe final words on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first on this one. First off, I lived in Israel-Palestine for the better part of 20 years, and most of that in Jaffa, which is one of the few places where Jews and Palestinians actually do live together, and it's certainly not without tension. And the tension is oftentimes palpable. However, it's possible. We can look at other examples about how it's possible and doesn't have to be perfect. Northern Ireland is, I think, one of the best ones, where they created a different system without answering the sort of bigger nationalistic questions that had been looming over the conflict and driving conflict for so long, in order to create a new reality where, honestly, just things are calmer. And once things are calmer, and once people have fewer grievances against each other, things can change slowly over time. And there are a lot of people, particularly today, particularly Palestinians, who would rightfully, say, why would you expect us or want us to live with the perpetrators of our genocide? At the same time, there are Palestinians living among Israelis today, and some of them may not be happy about it, but life does go on, albeit under an apartheid system. And, lastly, I'd just say that people tend to want to move on. People want to live their lives, to create a better future for their children. I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor who, like the family's priorities were not revenge, but building their life again. And I think that what we will find is that, at any sort of inflection point or junction where a possibility for a new future, particularly one that gives opportunity to everybody to thrive and to prosper, that people will overwhelmingly, not entirely, there will always be spoilers. And I grew up in Los Angeles, and there were riots in my childhood. Like this is not a unique problem to Israel-Palestine. There are going to be ethnic tensions anywhere there are different groups that are living together and treated differently and have different resources. But I believe that under the right circumstances, people would absolutely be willing and certainly able to do just that.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. Michael, Sarah, thank you both for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you.